And one more sec here. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about aspen ecology with the Idaho Native Plant Society. It's a really great opportunity. And so I'll start by discussing some of the values of aspen. I'll talk a little bit about aspen fire ecology. I'll provide some research findings about key aspen climate relationships from my own research, but also talk about it a little more broadly. Provide examples of disturbance interactions in aspen that are likely to be very important to aspen management and maintenance. And then discuss some implications for the future of aspen and likely management challenges ahead. One thing here. Okay. So aspen, as many of you know, has high value to biodiversity, especially in the Western United States, where it provides habitat for myriad species disproportionate to its total area in most Western US landscapes. Studies have shown that aspen often has higher numbers of species of plants, birds, some insect groups, especially compared to surrounding vegetation types. And this is due in part to the strong affinity of certain species for aspen, such as cavity nesting birds that take advantage of its thin bark and its often soft and rotted wood, as well as species like beaver that prefer aspen for dam building material and a food source, and in so doing create aquatic and riparian habitat that support numerous other species.
I'm okay with that.
Of course, aspen forests also provide significant socioeconomic value across much of the Western US. Aspen forests provide forage and cover for livestock and huntable and watchable wildlife. And in some areas, aspen forests produce economically valuable wood products. And studies have shown that aspen can have positive effects on water yield and water quality compared to adjacent conifer forest types. And aspen forests are also important due to the significant contribution they often make to local and state economies, particularly as a result of tourism to see fall colors. So in fact, the state of Idaho promotes aspen fall color tours to attract visitors that benefit local economies, as do many other interior Western states. And although not a panacea for problems of wildfire risk in the expanding wild and urban interface, aspen are also being considered as potential fire breaks to help protect some mountain communities from wildfire, such as this example of a nature conservancy project for a mountain ski town in Colorado. Aspen are less flammable under certain seasonal and fire weather conditions than conifer forests, and under such conditions may change the behavior of approaching crown fires from adjacent conifer dominated stands, causing them to drop to the ground or at least have less intense fire behavior and thus more manageable for fire suppression efforts. And these projects are largely experimental, but they could prove effective, at least in some environments. So aspen is considered the most widely distributed tree species in North America, and based on broadly defined aspen functional types for Western North America, as proposed by Rogers et al. And shown here in this map, aspen ranges from being a boreal forest species to forming scattered aspen parklands at the edge of the Northern Great Basin, the edge of the Northern Great Plains, to primarily consisting of montane forest types throughout much of the interior Western US. And of those montane types, aspen can range from basically pure stands of just aspen to mixed aspen conifer. And of course, looking at this map, one might assume that aspen is quite prevalent in Idaho, but of course, it really isn't, at least not in terms of its total land area. In fact, aspen forests only make up about 3% of the total forest area in Idaho, and far less than 1% of the total land area. As you can see in purple in this map, hopefully you can see those purple areas, but what you'll probably notice is that most of the aspen is in the lower part of the state, especially in the Northern Great Basin and along the margins of the eastern edge of the greater Yellowstone ecoregion. Once you get into the more central part of the state and the northern part of the state, aspen is certainly occurs on the landscape, but it typically is quite scattered in smaller patches. It just doesn't constitute as much of the overall forest area as it does in the southern part of the state. And I'll point out too that it's that southern portion where I've done most of my research in aspen, and some of which I'll present to you tonight. So I'd like to review some basics about aspen fire ecology. Most fires occurring in aspen can be considered high severity, as aspen are easily killed by fire, especially in mixed aspen conifer stands where crown fires are common. Aspen is considered highly fire adapted, in part because it's often a prolific reproducer after fire. Vegetative suckering from roots of aspen clones is its most common method of regeneration in the western United States. But sexual reproduction also occurs, particularly where post-fire environments are conducive for seedling establishment and survival. Aspen stands are often cereal to other tree species, especially conifers that can gradually replace aspen in the absence of fire. And thus many aspen stands are considered to be fire dependent. However, stable aspen stands that don't depend on fire are not uncommon, especially where conifer competitors are rare. So let's review those concepts in a little more detail. An idealized successional trajectory for cereal aspen includes 4 basic phases, as illustrated in these photos, starting at the upper left with a stand replacing fire, after which young and often even-aged stands of aspen develop quickly. As these aspen cohorts age, they gradually provide conditions more favorable for recolonization by shade-tolerant conifers. And as older stands become increasingly dominated by more mature conifers, aspen regeneration declines and the stands become more fire-prone, thus potentially repeating the cycle. And this cycle can create dynamic and spatially complex mosaics of aspen and conifer cover across large western landscapes. In contrast, stable or persistent aspen stands are generally considered self-sustaining, in which the rate of mortality of older trees does not exceed the rate of successional recruitment of the younger trees. These are often pure aspen stands with multi-cohort age structures in which there's a negative exponential relationship between tree age and density. In other words, we have far more younger trees than older trees. And this can occur through different mechanisms, through continuous or episodic recruitment, as we see in example number 1, where we might get canopy gap mortality caused by insects, disease, aging trees, and so on. It could occur through more extensive overstory mortality, as in this drought or an insect-killed overstory stand that we see here in example 2. But it can also occur through stand replacing fire events. So it's not so much a matter of no disturbance in persistent stands, but rather that a stand can persist through multiple generational rotations without a major disturbance event being required. But in fact, aspen fire regimes can be even more nuanced than that. In a 2013 paper, some colleagues and I performed a literature review of all peer-reviewed studies in the Western US that examined fire history or stand age structures in aspen stands to infer a relationship with fire. And based on those studies, we proposed that there are several potential classes or gradations of fire regimes in Western aspen forests based on a dual gradient of fire frequency, shown on the bottom, represented by the bottom axis in this figure, versus fire severity, which is represented on the left-hand side of the graph. And then simultaneously, as indicated by the green color, with the impact of an increasing conifer component, such that in the lower left-hand corner there, aspen stands might be represented by conditions where we have relatively pure aspen and in relatively protected environments that don't support fire, or at least not very, fire is very uncommon. And those stands are relatively fire independent and stable on the landscape. However, as aspen stands become more exposed to fire-prone conditions, either by the topographic position they're in, the flammability of the surrounding landscape or community types, the patch size of the aspen, or other factors, they become increasingly more likely to be influenced or affected by fire. And they also become more prone to competition with, and as they become more prone to competition with conifer species, they become increasingly more fire dependent and cereal in forest landscapes. In fact, we looked at these sorts of aspen stand dynamics in 3 mountain ranges in northern Nevada, just over the border with Idaho. The Jarbidge Independence Mountain Complex, the Santa Rosa Mountains, and the Ruby Mountains. And pure aspen stands are common in these ranges, with upper montane conifer cover largely absent or rare, with the notable exception of the central Jarbidge Mountains, which has a fairly substantial subalpine fir component. We sampled just over 100 aspen stands and used various forest measurement and dendrochronology techniques in this study. And a key finding was that age and size class distribution suggested that these aspen are largely self-replacing and stable in these mountain ranges. The figure at left indicates that aspen stands range from quite old to relatively young based on our dating of the oldest tree in each stand. However, the figures at right show that ample reproduction was occurring with this sort of negative exponential relationship I mentioned before between age and density across each mountain range and for the study area as a whole. And these age class distribution patterns were strongly consistent, even among different aspen forest types, pure aspen, riparian aspen, even aspen conifer. And these relationships were also commonly exhibited among individual stands, so not just occurring at a landscape scale. So despite finding very little evidence for fire in these stands, unlike say other aspen in other parts of the range, these aspen are apparently self-sustaining at the landscape scale and mostly at the stand scale as well. And similar findings have been reported elsewhere in the Great Basin, but not in all cases, especially studies that focused on locations where conifer competitors were more abundant, including work that Eva Strand has done in the Wahi Mountains, which are not too far from these sites. But an interesting thing about these stands is due to the absence of major fire events that would have produced pulses of aspen regeneration through time, climate was clearly the driver and was correlated with aspen establishment over time in these stands. And that included both a temporally lagged effect from climate as well as more contemporaneous relationships. So for instance, the figures at right illustrate how variability in the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is an index of relative moisture availability and dryness. So the higher peaks in the Palmer are wetter periods, and the the middle part of the graph there, and the lower parts are where we have drier periods, but also with maximum spring temperature. And both of those variables pretty clearly align with the variability in aspen establishment density over time. And those relationships were not completely contemporaneous, but they're apparent in the figure because we've realigned the climate variables to match up with the aspen peaks below, such that we get a 5-year lag in the effect of Palmer Drought Severity Index, and roughly a +1 year effect in maximum spring temperatures. And so basically what that is, and we had other variables that sort of showed similar relationships and similar timeframes, sort of either right around the time of aspen development or prior to aspen regeneration periods. We think these patterns suggest that aspen clones are producing and storing carbohydrate reserves during more favorable, especially wetter climate periods, and subsequent drier and warmer conditions, like when we have warmer spring temperatures, might be promoting canopy mortality, which then induce suckering and sucker growth, in part by allowing more sunlight to reach the forest floor, and because clones are able to capitalize on those stored energy reserves from those wetter periods that preceded each regeneration event. And on average, we're around 5 years before those regeneration events in terms of the relationship, the correlations. Of course, aspen do burn in this landscape, and some of those stands had some evidence of fire, but very little. But we have other, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead to slide, back up a little bit. There are other factors to consider as well. And so in that same study, we also looked at the potential impacts of browsing on young aspen by wild and domestic ungulates present on the landscape. That could also affect the rates of regeneration. And in that same study, then we found a significant difference in the proportion of suckers reaching recruitment height between plots classified as either low or high browse in our study area. And recruitment height is often considered to be around 2 meters tall, because that's generally tall enough for a young aspen to be less susceptible to mortality from browsing. However, I should point out that excessively browsed stands were relatively rare in our sites, and thus had pretty negligible effect on our landscape scale rates of recruitment. So in another study, and this is where we get back to the fire, we looked at aspen stands that had burned. In fact, we sampled aspen regeneration in various locations that had burned 5 to 15 years previously throughout the Northern Great Basin and into the Rocky Mountains. And results from our statistical models that we developed from that research strongly suggested that winter precipitation had positive effects on the density of both overall regeneration and recruitment-sized aspen. The early winter precipitation ratio had the largest effect size, and that's a metric we developed that represents the ratio of the average early winter precipitation during a 5-year post-fire period to the long-term average. So in other words, was the site wetter or drier after fire relative to the historical climate for that particular site? And similar to the previous study, indicators of browsing pressure also had a significant negative effect on recruitment densities. And just to quickly explain, in the figures above, the variables where the mean and the confidence intervals don't cross those vertical dashed lines were considered significant effects in our models, with positive effects to the right and negative effects to the left. So this suggests that winter precipitation is particularly important for aspen's persistence, especially under climate change, and particularly in the Great Basin, which receives most of its precipitation during the winter months. There's been a marked decline in snowpack across the Western US over recent decades. And in another recent study actually has predicted that under projections of future warming, there will be substantial reductions in annual maximum snow water amounts in the Northern Great Basin. And this could have consequences for aspen stands that exist there that depend on melting snow drifts for water subsidies during the generally dry growing seasons in our region. These aspen stands are often called snowdrift dependent or snow pocket aspen. So another concern, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, is sudden aspen decline, of which much of the most severe and extensive cases have been linked to the acute droughts of the early 2000s, and which variably affected aspen forests across its range and over time, resulting in much more extensive and higher rates of mortality in some areas compared to others. In Colorado, for example, 45% of the declined area mapped in that state in 2008 was rated as severe, with estimated overstory mortality exceeding 50%. So this had a substantial effect on the overstory of these stands. And some researchers have suggested that aspen forests, especially in places like Colorado, may have benefited from a combination of large fires and clearing by settlers in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and then prospered afterwards due to those early successional growing conditions combined with cooler and wetter than average conditions during the early 20th century, and that these dieback events might be a response to that sort of overabundance of aspen and a return to drier conditions. And of course, as the most broadly distributed tree species in North America, aspen occurs over a broad range of climate conditions, although it generally occurs where precipitation exceeds evapotranspiration. And in the Western US, it occurs at elevations where average annual temperature is generally below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Although, as I mentioned earlier, aspen communities can be found in more marginal settings, typically where there's ample soil or groundwater available due to snowdrifts, seeps, or riparian settings. However, attempts to more accurately define aspen's climate niche have led to some pretty dire projections of the future distribution of aspen in the West, as shown here by work by Rayfeld et al., which predicts a virtual disappearance of aspen's climate profile in the Great Basin, and in fact, throughout much of the Western US by as early as 2060, and certainly by 2090, under most of the global climate models that they used. Many of these areas that are projected to deviate the most from the suitable climate conditions for aspen, interestingly coincided with some of the same areas that have been affected by sudden aspen decline, as I mentioned earlier, especially on southwestern aspects and at lower elevations. But of course, these types of models, these climate niche models, have their limitations. They're core scale assessments. They don't take into account other factors such as hydrologic, edaphic, or fine scale topographic conditions. They don't model changing fire regimes or other disturbances. They don't model species movements, competition among species, land use effects, and so on. So there's a lot of variables that just aren't included in these sorts of models, even though they're highly instructive. Indeed, changing fire regimes is a primary concern throughout much of the West, and numerous studies are predicting increasing fire activity in the Western US under climate change over the next few decades. And just as an example here from California, researchers found that the burned area in California increased by 405% over the 47-year period of record that's shown here. And that this increase was highly correlated with atmospheric vapor pressure deficit, which is a measure of aridity. And the plot below shows that as maximum temperatures from March to October have increased by almost 2 degrees Celsius over the past 120 years, that corresponded to a 13% increase in vapor pressure deficit. And given these types of relationships and the likely occurrence elsewhere in the West, we would expect these types of patterns, of course, or these types of relationships to continue under future model climate projections, and that fire activity in many areas in the future would also go up as a result. And in fact, the area burned in the Great Basin aspen forests have increased significantly over the last 35 years. This is some unpublished results that I'm showing here from some work that I'm currently involved in, where I'm looking at the changes in fire activity in different types of ecosystems in the West over time. And in this case, we can see that there has been a significant increase in either aspen forest or aspen suitable habitat over the last 35 years, with roughly almost 300,000 acres of aspen or aspen habitat that has burned during that period. And that would roughly equate to about a 220-year fire return interval. But if given its current status, but if trends continue, we'd expect those fire-free intervals might even decrease even more so in the future. But of course, aspen is a fire-adapted species. So will more fire be beneficial? Well, that probably depends on multiple factors, including the relative fire dependency of an aspen stand, the interactions with climate, including and especially the conditions that affect regeneration after fire, interactions with other disturbance agents, including drought, excessive herbivory, insects or pathogens, and interactions with competitive species such as conifers, but also those that might benefit from more fire, including some non-native grasses. And one way to explore hypotheses about the future of aspen is to use landscape disturbance and succession models that can simulate changing climate and fire regimes, but also simulate climate effects on regeneration, species competition, the ability of species to move and reproduce on the landscape, and so on. And I'm only going to quickly summarize a few examples from my own research here, but in one study, my colleagues and I developed a projection, or developed projections that suggest that more fire under a warming climate might result in aspen replacing some conifer forests at higher elevations, so potentially beneficial there. But that fire could hasten aspen's demise at lower elevations, especially where climate scenarios suggested that conditions would become increasingly less suitable for regeneration. And in another study where we used the same type of modeling approach, we found in this case in Reynolds Creek Experimental Watershed in Southwestern Idaho, that by simulating shifts in snowdrift water availability that might be expected from a hotter climate, snowdrift dependent aspen stands are unlikely to receive adequate growing season soil water subsidies to support regeneration rates necessary for replacement of aging and dying overstories. So at these more moderate elevations, unlike in the former example, and I think I failed to mention that former example was in the Jarbidge Mountains in northern Nevada, which are higher in elevation. But in this case, at these more moderate elevations where snowpacks are really critical for aspen, essentially for aspen persistence, these older aspen trees would continue to age and die in our model, but the climate conditions are not adequate for replacement by younger aspen. So in addition to modeling, there are other reasons to think that low elevation aspen forests in particular are at risk due to changing climate and fire regimes. And in the Great Basin rangelands, especially where you have aspen that border low elevation areas, so at the lower ecotones, they may already be being affected by changing climate and non-native fire-prone grasses that promote very large fires. So for instance, the 2018 South Sugarloaf fire in northern Nevada burned nearly 250,000 acres, and it started in sagebrush steppe, but burned up into drought-stressed aspen and adjacent conifer stands. And the ability of those aspen stands to regenerate after such events will likely depend on factors such as the climate and browsing impacts on regenerating young trees, but also the health of the stand before fire. In other words, does the stand have the energy reserves that it needs to vigorously reproduce? And at the lower right, for instance, we can see a lower elevation stand, and in this case in central Nevada, that suffers from multiple threats, including heavy browsing, with almost no recruitment size young trees in the understory, an invasion of flammable cheatgrass into the understory, and encroachment of pinyon and juniper trees. And these conditions could cause more severe or frequent burning in the future, and if combined with continued browsing pressure or drought, this clone may lack the capacity to successfully regenerate at some point, leading to a wildfire-driven forest conversion to another type. So what are the management challenges ahead, and what are some key factors to guide aspen conservation strategies? Well, first, we should expect, I think, unique responses among different aspen types to changes in climate and fire regimes. So for example, post-fire regeneration responses will likely vary among functional types and along elevational and moisture gradients. So we shouldn't really expect a uniform response. Second, we should expect regional to local scale differences as well, based on climate change effects, including patterns of drought, different patterns of diminishing snowfall or snowpack, and as a result of different patterns and trends in climate-induced fire frequency. And this may present contradictory signals for land managers and may suggest that adaptive management approaches are really going to be critical, and that they're constructed commensurate to the events and the dynamics that are occurring within a given landscape, and not a one-size-fits-all approach. Third, I think we should expect the unexpected as novel combinations of stressors become more likely, including unprecedented climate shifts and plant interactions that could fundamentally alter the role of fire and create less favorable conditions for post-fire aspen regeneration. And these changes could lead to rapid and irreversible change, including type conversion and aspen forest loss, as has been suggested by other models. However, I don't want to be guilty of projecting an overly dire future for aspen. I suggest that another key step is to better assess aspen vulnerability using science and using good field data, but also spatial analyses and statistical modeling. Do a better job of assessing the aspen vulnerability among these different environments, which could then help us to develop and prioritize aspen conservation measures that are most likely to be effective over the long term. And that's really all I have. This is work that I've been doing in part based on support from the USGS climate adaptation science centers, as well as a lot of collaborators from federal, state, university, and other partners, and of course with lots of help in the field from field techs and others. So there's a lot of folks behind a lot of these ideas and some of the research that I presented. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. This is a really good presentation, and we already have several questions in the chat room. So I will read some of the questions now, and if you have questions after that, given the number of people, I think you can go ahead and unmute yourself. But the one question is, are aspen important for biodiversity because of where aspen grow, or because they create habitat for so many plants and animals? So
yeah, that's a good question. I suppose it's a little of both, but certainly they do create really excellent habitat, and studies have shown that aspen actually have the capacity to actually affect things like soil, making them more productive, more nutrient rich, for instance, which sort of create these very productive and valuable habitats. But of course, by way of their productivity, their structure, shade, food sources, and so on, They just provide a lot of valuable attributes for a number of species. There's been, not as many studies as you might think on increases in avian diversity in aspen relative to surrounding habitats, increases in plant diversity. A few studies in Rocky Mountain National Park, for instance, that have really shown that aspen have a much higher percentage of the native plant species, relative to other surrounding conifer habitats. So they clearly contribute to biodiversity. Although, again, in the literature, it's surprising that there's not more research on that, especially in the Western US. But the studies that are out there, clearly demonstrate those kinds of values. Butterflies as well. I've seen research that has shown that butterfly diversity is much higher than aspen forests. So,
yeah, no, that's right. Let's see. There was another question here. They're just coming in a lot of questions. Okay. Yeah, one question is here. With climate change, can northern Idaho expect more aspen forest?
Wow, that's a really good question.
It is.
I don't know. Part of the challenge, of course, is how much aspen is already on the landscape, and then the potential for it to expand, and how quickly can it expand. If aspen primarily reproduces vegetatively, expansion might be fairly slow. If there are opportunities for sexual reproduction through dispersal of propagules, greater distances, then obviously there might be some potential for aspen to capitalize on recently disturbed forests and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of it really depends on what those climate conditions are going to be like. Again, if you look at the modeling from Rayfeld that I showed earlier, I think it is sort of those northern Rockies regions that tend to hang on to some of their aspen more so than others. So that would certainly suggest that places like northern Idaho might have a better shot than certainly places like northern Nevada. But highly variable depending on specific land and growing conditions, climate change effects that are going to be variable over space and time. So it's a challenge to know for certain.
Yeah.
Doug, could you stop sharing your screen so we can see you and the others more readily?
Oh, am I still? Okay, sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is that better?
Okay. Yeah, that's better. Go ahead.
And everybody go ahead and turn on your cameras and you can ask questions. You can unmute yourself at this point. So I think it's open discussion from now on. In the meantime, we have one question here that might be a good question from a group like this. What can local citizens do to foster aspen conservation and awareness?
Well, another really good question. I think that there certainly are opportunities in some cases to be involved in aspen restoration projects, whether it be volunteers that might help with fencing to ameliorate browsing pressure. In many cases, the Forest Service is using prescribed burns to try to perpetuate aspen on the landscape and keep it intact. So, most of the things I think that really are going to help aspen require a fair amount of effort and a lot of resources. Building and maintaining fences over the long term is a fairly involved process, for instance, and of course that limits that type of conservation to those areas where you can actually build those fences and maintain them. But I think in many other cases, it really comes down to forest management, whether it's how fire is utilized on the landscape or how timber harvest might affect aspen, and how, as citizens, you play a role in that. I don't know, other than just being aware of what's going on with aspen in your neck of the woods and how those management practices may be either helping or hurting, the potential for aspen to stay on the landscape. And I'm sure that local Forest Service offices have opportunities for volunteer efforts, along those lines. But off the top of my head, I don't know of any in northern Idaho, to be honest. But maybe you all do. Are there aspen restoration projects going on up there that you all are aware of?
I don't think there are too many, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
There are a few down here, like on the Boise and the Sawtooth. There's been some
Yeah.
prescribed fires
Yeah,
that have
no,
been.
up here there really aren't. I mean, it's
Mhm.
all classified as aspen habitat, but
Mhm.
and maybe with more fire we will have more aspen.
Yeah.
But there really isn't very much aspen up here.
Yeah, and that's, which is interesting because, you know, it's not that common there, but it probably is all the more valuable because it isn't that common, because it's, you know, it's this very productive and very diverse forest type that's very patchy and scattered on the landscape. So where it occurs, it's probably quite valuable, you know, relative to an area that's just, you know, has tons of aspen, like parts of Utah or Colorado, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where losing a few acres of aspen might not be a big deal, as opposed to, say, you know, parts of Idaho where, you know, it's so rare that you really want to hang on to it, I think, where you can, where it makes sense with the natural processes that are occurring on the landscape.
Yeah. I was really impressed with the map that you showed, Doug, with all the plots that you had all over the western states. And I just wondered, how old is the oldest aspen that you have sampled?
Oh, well, I hope I didn't misrepresent that. That was actually studies we looked at in a literature review. So that
Oh,
one
okay.
scattered across the Western US
Well,
were other
that's
people's research.
still plenty.
Yeah, so almost all of my research has been in northern Nevada, southern Idaho, and a little bit into Wyoming and Montana, but just a little bit. Yeah, that's sort of those are my stomping grounds.
Yeah, but
Yeah, we have quite a few in northern Nevada, and we've got that we've sampled. Although we haven't been to some of those sites in a while. So
did you age the aspen? Did you age them?
We did, yeah. In many cases, and in one study we did. Yep.
How old were they? I mean, it seems like they never really actually get very old. The aspen.
No, they really don't. I think, you know, I think our oldest, I have to try to remember now, but I think it was like 170 or so, you know, 80, something like that.
I think the oldest one that I ever recorded was 140, 145.
Yeah, and I might even be exaggerating a little bit just by, you know, case of bad memory here, but I believe that's roughly what it was. But yeah, most of ours were, you know, the oldest trees were often, you know, 120 to 100, 140. I mean, if you look at that one graph that I showed, I think our oldest stand we dated, I'd have to find it, but it's back to, I think, around 1830s. So,
yeah.
so that particular one, that would have been our oldest tree, essentially, or a couple of trees in that stand.
But don't they think that some of the clones have been in one place for really much longer than any given stand?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Some of the clone research that's going on in Utah with the various researchers, but Karen Mock has done some really interesting things, for instance, with the genetics of these ancient clones, but they estimate thousands of years, possibly since around the time of the last ice age, essentially the end of the last ice age. They don't really know for sure, I think, is the sort of the common thought on that, but that's the estimates are that they could be that old. Maybe you all know more about that than I do, but and I'm sure it varies greatly. But some of those clones are very large and very long-lived, hundreds of years in many cases, I'm sure, and thousands of years in some cases. So.
Yeah, it's really an amazing species. There's another question here. Looking at the pictures, and this is Susan's question. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, you should just go ahead and do that.
Can do that. In looking at the pictures and recall from time spent around Chalice as a child, I'm struck by the association of aspen with sagebrush. And it appears that aspen can grow in areas that may be too hot or dry for conifers. Is that it? I know they have to have a water source.
Yeah, it's really dependent on the water availability. And then in many cases in those pictures, there just aren't conifer competitors present. They're at mid and high elevations, they're just absent. There aren't the Douglas firs and the subalpine firs or lodgepole pine in those Great Basin ranges. You know, those ranges are all very different. So one might be almost entirely pure aspen, and then you can go right next door to the next range, and it might have a few conifer species that are, you know, maybe not super abundant, but are, you know, you'll find on the landscape some of the 5-needle pines or Doug fir or whatever. But in those cases where you're seeing them at that elevation, those are the more, generally the more, mesic, more productive sagebrush environments. And the temperatures are certainly adequate for aspen in many cases. But you're right, they often have to have a reliable water source in those generally arid environments. So there's either snow accumulation or seeps or, small riparian features or other, groundwater availability that permits their, persistence in those landscapes.
Yeah, the other thing that I recall, I believe that when wolves were introduced into Yellowstone, they were tracking, and aspen recovery improved after introduction of the wolves because it decreased the elk browsing in the aspen stands. Yeah,
that's certainly been the findings of a group of researchers who focused on that they believe they have evidence that suggests that the wolves keeping the native ungulates moving on the landscape have protected those aspen stands and allowed them to recover in many cases. But there's been some somewhat contrarian research that's been going on too that suggests that may be a overstated dynamic. So there's a little back and forth in the literature. I'm not sure what's come out recently. Maybe some of you have seen some of this research lately to see where the battle on that idea currently lies. But yeah, there have been a group of researchers that have provided pretty convincing evidence that some of those predators are moving the elk around enough to potentially benefit aspen and willows and other species as well in the riparian areas. There's another really interesting study too, where aspen were removed from Heart Mountain National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. And there was, I think it was actually the same group of researchers, but there was some follow-up research that was done on the recovering bird communities as well. But they, again, were able to demonstrate that when, in this case, when cattle were removed, I don't know if I said elk, but I meant to say cattle were removed from Heart Mountain, that there was a pretty dramatic recovery of riparian habitats and aspen habitats and much better rates of regeneration, and that in some cases it reflected positively on bird communities as well. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are good question. If Jim Peak is there, I mean, I see you are there. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. But Jim has a really long question about deer, elk, and moose. And Jim, of course, is the wildlife biologist.
Can you hear me on this?
Yes.
I can.
Oh, you can, huh?
Yeah.
The folks in the Clearwater Advisory Council are talking about burning aspen stands to regenerate them. And in my opinion, all this does, it'll concentrate elk and deer and moose up there, all right. But they got black bears and wolves and cougars, and what else do you think they're going to concentrate? So my thought is on a lot of this stuff is it's just a lot of the efforts to regenerate aspen with fire are just too small. They don't consider the consequences. The other part of that issue is I've looked at stuff in the Jarbidge and through to the Yellowstone and central Idaho and southwestern Montana a lot, and in every case the browsing is a major effect. And I was wondering across your areas that you've looked at, how do you look at browsing as a major impact on regen?
My research hasn't focused on browsing quite as much as a lot of other researchers in this field. I've looked at it more as a sort of a background rate of disturbance, because I haven't keyed in on those, trying to compare heavily browsed landscapes to less heavily browsed landscapes, or done experimental studies or that sort of thing in browsing. And so in my research, which often is in pretty remote areas where the browsing is a little more dispersed, we've seen localized effects, but at the landscape scale, especially in parts of northern Nevada, it just doesn't seem to be having quite as much of an impact on overall rates of regeneration. When we pool all our, tree regeneration together at a landscape scale. But at local scales, it clearly does even there. There's other researchers that have shown, yeah, some of the things you just mentioned, which are really good points. You know, these small fires can be magnets for browsers, and then it can, you know, have a negative effect potentially on the potential for those stands to regenerate or for aspen to be very successful. I believe it's Sam St. Clair that did down in Utah that did some really interesting research looking at the size of fire and the aspen succession rates. And there's other factors they looked at too. I believe it was fire severity and the presence of conifer competitors and so on. But I'm pretty much sure that I recall that one of the results was these larger fires were generally more likely to have you know, higher, more successful rates of regeneration of aspen for the very reasons you mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jim, there's some research in Canada from quite a ways back where they were looking at the anticipated browsing from wild herbivores and burning areas that would be suitable. And what they were trying to avoid was burning areas that were too small, so that the browsers would take out the aspen.
Right.
But they were also trying to avoid burning areas that were too large, because if the browsing effect was not very heavy, the treatment would not last as long as it could. And so they were trying to balance this, not burning enough and burning too much, depending on what their anticipated browsing level was by different critters.
Right. And I think a lot of that depends on the local landscape and the browsing species that are present and the management of those species. You know, I've done some touring around in central Nevada and have seen fires where, you know, the local managers had aspen recovering right after the fire. It was a fairly sizable fire, but within a few years saw those young aspen literally, you know, just not hanging in there, not being able to keep up with the browsing levels, fenced those aspen. But at that point was often, you know, in some cases was too late. They fenced in aspen that had burned, trying to protect it, but the clone presumably just essentially didn't have enough in it anymore, you know, to be able to bounce back. So yeah, I mean, not only, and that's a case where they, you know, there was all, you know, both native and you know, domestic browsers were just putting a tremendous amount of pressures on these stands. And by the time the managers really realized how bad it was literally, you know, too little, too late to fence some of those stands. So I think it varies a lot, you know, depending on, again, the browsing species, the level of pressure, the management influences on those browsers. But there's no question they can have a tremendous impact in many cases. So.
Yeah, we have a comment here also from Ron Jones about that the larger fires in recent years removed much of subalpine fir and increased aspen regrowth in the hills south of Twin Falls. And that the moose population is thriving in that area.
Right. Yeah.
So Ron, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself, that would be good as well. And Ron suggests that recent big fires will be a good test, but that low watershed is subject to drought, and that aspen may not come back. So that elevation you talked about, Doug.
Yeah, so that's a question I'm really interested in. In fact, Eva, I know you know Paul Rogers.
Yeah. Oh, yes, definitely.
Paul and Tim Asal. You may not know Tim, but he's a former USGS researcher who's now with in a university setting. But we're going to look at some of those questions in the next couple of years. We've gotten some funding to do that, to look at the effects of these fires at that lower ecotone, to find out how well aspen are regenerating along those sagebrush aspen ecotones. So we'll look at both burned and unburned stands and see if there are, you know, patterns, both either, you know, because of the types of fires or the timing of the fire, or the climate condition, or other factors that might be, as well as the, you know, environmental settings that might be influencing the relative ability of these stands to regenerate. And interestingly, like I said, in that one picture that I showed earlier, we've also potentially got this new dynamic with cheatgrass even moving into some of these stands. I don't know that it's a major threat right now, but if it combined with other factors might lead to more frequent fires in those landscapes, it'd be interesting to see how that might affect aspen's ability to recover.
Yeah, definitely. That elevational gradient is gonna really make a big.
If I remember right, you put out a paper not too long ago, right, where you looked at anecdotally looked at some cheatgrass aspen interaction. I can't remember where that was.
Yeah, no.
The cheatgrass was it? Maybe it was just lower elevation.
Yeah, it was
sagebrush. Aspen interaction.
Yeah, and south-facing aspect. It seems like south-facing aspects were the aspen stands. The older stems were dying, and their regeneration was kind of coming back, but it was still in that question that is it going to actually turn into a new stand or not?
Right, and of course, a lot of you have probably seen in some of those stands where you've got the aspen almost seems like it's expanding out from the stand. You'll have those like fairy ring, suckering effects where you can see the younger aspen are further out, and they it's like a triangle, right, of aspen heights as you go into the stand. In other cases, almost no regeneration.
Yeah.
And is that entirely land use and browsing impact? Is that climate? Is it, what factors are influencing those different trends? And those are sort of some of the questions we hope to look at with this new study. So.
Yeah, that sounds great. There's one more question here about, has anyone looked into the changed ecology of aspen in relation to bird and pollinator populations? Bird
it's not my expertise, but there has been some research on that in a few locations. We actually did have a master's student that worked with us in our work in the Jarbidge and found some interesting patterns among birds in these different aspen stand conditions based on age and conifer presence and that sort of thing. I know there's been some research elsewhere too, parts of Nevada, the Heart Mountain area has some interesting bird aspen relationship studies. So there are definitely research studies out there that have addressed this. In terms of, it depends a little bit too on the type of study you're talking about. There certainly are other studies that look at, post-fire effects on bird communities, the presence of snags, and whether or not what's coming back after the fire, whether it's aspen or other species. But honestly, there's not as much in the more pure aspen stand conditions or more aspen dominated landscapes, at least in the Great Basin. There's not as much research as I might have otherwise thought before I really got, heavily into looking at aspen. So there is some research, but yeah. Good area to do more work.
Yeah, there's definitely more work to do there.
Yeah.
And they just being in aspen stands, they just seem so much more diverse and contribute to diversity to the
absolutely. Yeah, especially cavity nesters and
the woodpeckers and so if you have any other questions, I think we're kind of closing in here on 7:30 and but we can take a couple more questions.
I have one.
Oh, okay, Jim, go ahead.
I think Nancy had one too, but it seems to me like the size of the fire that needs to be used in any given drainage where you're trying to regen or improve aspen or remove the conifers from it or whatever. The size of the fire is something that needs to be looked at really critically. How much do you have to burn to minimize the concentration of animals and whatnot? This kind of thing is what bothers me, and that's a touchy issue. I think in Pete King Creek in the Lochsaw, I'd be just as happy to see him burn the whole drainage. And that'd upset everybody something double bloody fierce. So it isn't going to happen. But in reality, there is a need to understand how big a burn needs to be created in order to
Yeah.
do what you want with the aspen and let it regenerate.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. And I don't have a quick answer to that one. Because again, it's one of those, it depends types of situations, I think.
Yeah.
But it's an important question. I agree. And obviously bigger fires can be more problematic for various reasons. So it can be a little tricky. I will also say though, at least where you have pure aspen, the temptation to want to burn those pure aspen thinking that they need fire could in some cases be counterproductive, especially if you're removing the structural diversity, and in so doing. So you've got these stands that have, a nice diversity of older and middle-aged and younger trees, and then you burn those stands and you're left with young trees. And that, getting back to the issue or the question about, bird habitat and the avian diversity, that's where you might lose species that depend on those more mature trees, like cavity nesters or others that rely on, bigger tree environments. So there's drawbacks to burning too much too, in some cases.
Yeah, that is a really good point. Those stands seem to be doing well, just the way they are.
Mm-hmm.
And one final question here from Nancy. Are there reliable maps of where aspen colonies are in the Clearwater and Nez Perce forests and also on the Palouse edge? So kind of up in our neck of the woods here. Reliable maps.
Yeah, reliable maps. Well, at the forest level, I don't know, because there may be, different forests may have different quality of maps at that sort of scale and for that kind of detail. More broadly, there's not really great maps for aspen in some ways, because the more nationally available vegetation layers like the GAP data or landfire and so on, they pick up the bigger patches, but a lot of those small patches, especially in the drier environments or in the more heavily forested environments, like a lot of central and northern Idaho, those small patches are going to be missed in those sorts of Landsat, remotely sensed, classified forest layers. And yet, we know those small patches are out there. They exist. They're scattered about. And I suspect those are the ones that are really, in fact, I know they're just really undermapped, obviously, because they're small and they're scattered, and their signal in terms of the classification procedure gets washed out by, surrounding forest types. And so they're just not well mapped. So not a great answer, but.
That's really, no, it is a great answer. I think that's really good.
Nancy, I've got a comment on that if you got time.
Sure.
I've had some experience with the folks on the Powell district of the Clearwater, and I'll bet you that their GIS person could identify the map, could identify those aspen stands on that district.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, there's expertise around here to do that, but whether it's useful for folks or not, or whether it's, I mean, they all got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, looking at, finer scale aerial imagery, for instance, nape imagery or that sort of thing, I'm sure that could be done. But I don't, again, maybe some of you know more about this than I do. I don't know of any extensive efforts to do that on the national forest that I work with, at least.
No, and it's really hard to differentiate map from other.
It is willows and
shrubs.
Probably
shrubs.
Mountain shrubs. Yep, agreed. So. Can get to be quite challenging. We do it on sort of a case-by-case basis as we're trying to, delineate our sampling areas and verifying that where we're going to go to is aspen.
Yeah.
But it's, it's not a systematic, broad-scale mapping effort. It's more opportunistic, just to make sure we're going to the right spot.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, I think we'll have to stop the question answer session here. If you have any questions, please email them to me or Penny. And I think Penny has a few other comments here for the group. So go ahead, Penny.
Okay, I just wanted to remind, thank you, Doug, first of all. Well done. We really appreciate it. It's fun for us with Zoom to be able to bring you in from Boise, and some of our speakers have come from elsewhere. So
Well, I enjoyed it, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah.
and just as a reminder to the membership, keep an eye out on your email. We're expect to have at least 2, maybe 3 different Zoom presentations between now and May, including a couple of our students who have been partially supported by INPS funds that come from membership and the plant sale. So that's another reason to support our online plant sale when it happens in May. Please do. So with that, I think we are done for the evening.
Thank you.